months ago, we had a switch at the Center for Steward Leaders at Luther Seminary, and I was pleased to talk with my friend Glenn Tybel about that change that was taking place as he was serving as the interim director, and he alerted me to who was coming. And he told me about this person that was up at Concordia College and teaching up there who had done some work in mission development, and he said, but there's one thing about him, he's a Presbyterian. Well, I was pleased when I met this Presbyterian and found out some of the good work that he's been doing, found out that he has had a front page article most recently on Christian Century in one of the topics that he'll cover tonight. He has written a lot, he's taught a lot of students, and he knows especially the younger generation. For persons my age, a lot of people are younger, but he knows those millennials and others and giving patterns and things. So we are pleased to have with us Adam Copeland. Adam will have two talks with us tonight, so I won't have as extensive a time to introduce him the next time. But in his first topic, he'll be talking about young adults and giving patterns, and the subtitle is From Myth to Ministry. Let's welcome Adam Copeland.
Well, thanks for the welcome, Larry. It's nice that I know there are ecumenical folks in this room and those joining us, but mostly this is a Lutheran crowd. So as a Presbyterian, I'd say thank you for welcoming me. I feel like it was preordained that I be here. As Larry said, I am going to be talking about young adults tonight, and so I'm just going to claim it up front. I am a young adult. I'm about 32 years old. I think, 32 years old. It changes every year. It's so hard to keep up with. But this year I'm 32. And in one of my previous calls, I was a mission developer of a ministry called the Project FM, it was in Fargo-Moorhead, that's the FM. And it was a mission development particularly looking at how to bring together young adults who weren't connected to any sort of faith community. So how to focus on young adults and building a faith community there. And so I've got this experience of working with young adults in my background, and then taught at Concordia for a while, and now I find myself at Luther Seminary. And for as long as I can get away with saying this, I'm going to claim loud and clear that I'm not a stewardship expert. I just play one at Luther Seminary. So when I came to this topic, since I'm not an expert, I figured, well, how do I think about young adults and giving today? And so I thought I would come together with some questions. What makes young adults give? What's the church doing with young adults and giving today? And so I knew a little bit because I had led this young adult ministry. I knew a little bit about stewardship, but I figured, well, I should probably ask around the church and see what we were experiencing about young adults. So I figured I'd take this approach. It'd be easy, right? I would first I would study young adults, figure out what folks are saying about young adults today. Often we talk about the millennials, this generation of folks born between 1980 and 2000 or so. There's always these headlines about the millennials. So for step one, I'll just find out what the millennials are about. Step two, I'd find churches that ask these same questions and then learn from those churches about how millennials are thinking about giving and how the churches have thought about young adults and how they've changed their practices in response. This was a good plan, right? Yeah, some of you are laughing. I ended up running into trouble at every corner. I found out that people love to talk about young adults, those born between 1980 and 2000 or so, but the church hasn't necessarily shifted our practices in response to what we know about them. Along the way, I found this Time cover story. I'll read it. The font is small. It's called the Me Generation. The subtitle, Millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. Why they'll save us all. And since this came out, the internet got to do what the internet does. Then they made the Me Generation. Choral composers are lazy, self-entitled narcissists with stupid batons. why they'll save us all. And since the internet is really run by cats, the meow, meow, meow generation, it's a cat's world out there. We're all just living in it, why they'll save us all. Oh, I didn't see this before. It's about, the original article is by Joel Stein. This one is by Meow Stein. So there's, these are jokes, but we'll see often all these highlights, all these headlines about young adults. We like to throw around these stereotypes about young adults these days, and often, we can, if we call them millennials, we can throw around even more stereotypes because it sounds like we're talking about a generation. We're using this fancy word. But as I looked into the details, I started wondering if all these headlines can be true. I mean, not all millennials can live in their parents' basements, right? Actually, my parents don't even have a basement. And not all millennials don't believe in God and never go to church. I'm 32. I get paid to teach church leaders. So I started thinking, well, what's a different way to look at these stereotypes about young adults? Certainly, sure, times are changing, and young adults are changing with the times, like we all are. But it seems dangerous to talk about a whole generation with one brush. Many in our congregations, after all, would be offended if we started a sentence like, well, old people these days, and then went on complaining. So similarly, I think we shouldn't, in the church, talk about all young adults these days with these huge generalizations about them. There are 70 million people in the so-called millennial generation. That's over 70 million people that God wonderfully and fearfully made as unique individuals. As I started asking these questions, I ran into Andrew Lindner. He's a sociologist at Skidmore College. He said some of the dangers when we start talking about young adults is we think about these entire generational cohorts rather than individual groups within generations. He said generational theories tend to conflate cohort effects with age and time period. In many cases, traditional dividing lines like social class, race, and gender explain a lot more about social patterns than generational differences do. When I think about the diversity of young adults I know, I think of an unmarried young adult who makes over $200,000 and drives a BMW. I think about a married couple who together make $35,000 and who rely on public transport and their bicycles. Think about some young adults with enormous generosity, giving over 10% of their income away. And I think about some that rarely give anything to their congregation or to charity. I know young adults who rent apartments for $500 a month and young adults who own $500,000 houses. I know those with graduate degrees and got through undergrad and graduate with no student loans. And I know a young adult with over $250,000 of student loans. So instead of talking about young adults in these broad generalizations, I'm going to try to flip things a little bit here. And I'm going to talk about the church with broad generalizations. I've drawn together then 5 myths that we in the church will often tell about young adults. So 5 myths about young adults and 5 suggested corrections. So myth number 1. Young adults don't want to talk about money. Pastor Greg Meyer is the founding pastor of Jacob's Well Church in Minneapolis. They have a high percentage of young adults in their congregation. Jacob's Well often will use sermon series in their approach to worship, and they'll often actually survey those in their congregation about what series they might be interested in having. Pastor Greg Meyer says, of those topics in response to the survey, always in the first 3 is people wanting sermons on money. People are hungry for a conversation about money in their faith community. Greg said, money is a huge hurt in people's lives. At best, it's unused potential, and at worst, it's a deep place of pain. Sure, most young adults, like anyone, we don't want to be talked to about money. We don't want people, some who make thousands of dollars more than us and who grew up in very different time periods than us. We don't want to be lectured by those folks about money, about why we should give more and spend less. But this doesn't mean we don't want to talk about money. In fact, this congregation of young adults asks to talk about it every sermon series. So correcting myth number one, we in the church can talk about money in real, honest, and holistic ways. As I was working on this talk, I spoke with Grace Duddy Pomeroy. She used to work at Luther Seminary, now she works with Portico. And she's a young adult herself, and she thinks a lot about young adults and giving. She said many young adults long for an integrated approach to money. They don't want to compartmentalize their lives between church and everything else. They want a place that connects the dots between the power of money in their lives and the power of God. We do want to talk about money, and we must, and church leaders then should talk about it in ways that are honest and often vulnerable. We know from studies, I've got the studies at Luther, that pastors themselves carry a huge amount of debt. I don't know if I can say this, I won't share this number, but I saw the numbers recently of those incoming students at Luther Seminary, and it's above the average undergraduate debt in Minnesota. Average undergraduate debt in Minnesota of those who take on debt in college is $31,000. And then think about graduate degrees beyond that. So we know from studies pastors have a lot of debt themselves. And Greg Meyer at Jacobs Well said, I did the first sermon series on money in part because my wife and I needed it. And so I had to honestly admit before the congregation that we struggled with this together. And that openness that they had in their congregation talking about money helped open up a conversation with the broader community. Myth number two, to engage young adults, simply find an area of passion and expand from there. When I was running the Project FM, this young adult faith community, I'd often get invited by other congregations or synods to talk about young adults and their communities. And I'd talk about the great stuff that Project FM was doing, and I'd always get this question, well, how do you get them to show up? And I'd always answer it this way, well, so I listen hard for the passion in young adults. And so if somebody shows up once to something and talks about their passion for caring for animals, then a few weeks later we'd volunteer at the Animal Society, and always trying to connect with their passions. That's fine, that's an approach to ministry. But at a conference a few weeks ago, around a topic like this, a pastor raised his hand and said, when it comes to money, I'm less interested in engaging already existing passions than I'm interested in shaping passions. And that stuck with me. So correcting myth two, let's cast a vision and help shape passions. David King of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving addressed the topic of young adults and giving this way. He said, many young people actually read ministry's mission and vision statements. Young people care about what you stand for. And they often think, I want to give to a place where I've seen mission in action. So the church can help shape giving patterns if we unveil the mystery of the church budget. If we don't talk about giving to keep the lights on, but if we talk about giving because a ministry feeds the hungry and heals the sick and welcomes the stranger. If we talk about those and that passion of that vision that Catherine read from in Revelation, we can work towards shaping that and living into that rather than just seeing numbers on a page. David King described a paradigm shift in the church from members approaching giving as a financial contribution to approaching giving as creating change. So if giving is creating change, then there's something deeply theological about how we're using money to help bring about part of God's vision in the world or catch up to what God is already doing. Myth number three, money matters most. It's been interesting directing the Center for Stewardship Leaders at Luther, because when I tell folks about the center's work, those folks aren't connected to congregations, Often when they hear stewardship, they just think environmental care, care for the creation. That's great. In the church, though, when we hear stewardship, often we think money. And maybe secondarily we'll think environment or holistic stewardship. I'm all for holistic stewardship. I think the Center for Stewardship Leaders and all our stewardship conversations should appreciate that financial stewardship is one part of a larger puzzle. But at the end of the day, money certainly does matter. It matters for ministry. And it may not matter first when talking to young adults, but it certainly matters a great deal. To correct this myth then, let's focus on generosity and the variety of ways to give. I talked to Jordan Elton. She's 22. She works for a nonprofit in DC that engages young adults in social action. Jordan cautioned, young adults definitely need a lot of convincing to get invested in a cause. That investment may not start with a financial gift. Instead, young people want to volunteer first with an organization before giving. Jordan said, I often will give and volunteer. I like to see the progress that's being made in an organization. And at the end of the day, I may make a gift. And I know it's not all about me, but it's about what I see going on in that place that gets me excited. In stewardship language, we'll often talk about those classic 3 T's of stewardship: time, talent, and treasure. And there's a 4th forgotten T, that of testimony. Testimony or story is a powerful and often unaddressed aspect of stewardship ministry. To engage young adults, then, we can ask people to tell their stories in our congregation. Ask people to share when they saw generosity or the generosity they see in the community. Ask young adults to share what about the congregation's ministry is exciting or meaningful to them. For some young adults, investing time and talent will come before investing in treasure. The money may follow, but only after a period of cultivation and different ways of giving, some of which comes through the power of story. Myth number 4. Young adults don't have money. You know all those headlines about millennials these days? 9 times out of 10, those headlines come from a survey, and that survey was sponsored by a large corporation that wants to understand young adults so they can sell things to young adults because young adults have money. Not all of us have great amounts of money, of course. We may not have as much as you did when you were young adults, but when the church itself does itself a great disservice if we pretend that young adults just don't have any money at all. So then we can ask for money to correct the myth, carefully, wisely, and compassionately. Very few young people give to congregations these days without being asked. As it's often noted, many young adults have developed a general distrust of institutions. Likewise, we don't give to the church out of a sense of obligation or duty, as might have been true in the past. But if asked, we'll often give. Talk to Timothy Seiberg. He's a young adult himself, and he went to Pacific Lutheran University. His parents went there as well. Tim said, you can't just write one giving letter or even email or Facebook post and expect it to resonate with everyone in his community. Tim, when he gets a letter from PLU asking for gifts, will compare it to those letters his parents gets from PLU. They're very different sorts of letters with very different asks. To join the young alumni group, there may just be any donation, but the letter that Tim's parents are getting looks very different. Myth number 5. Electronic giving is the tool. When I say, I'm working on something about young adults and giving, often folks will say, oh, no, our church thought about it a little bit. And more time than I cares to count when I ask folks, oh, you thought about young adults and giving, great, what did you do? They'll say, well, now you can give online. I say, okay. Well, you can give online. That's great. Online giving in various forms is an important first step. Now there's programs, Simply Giving is a program often used in the ELCA. It's helpful for those who can give regularly through a bank draft or a debit card or credit card. That's important. Don't get me wrong. Please take that step. But let's not stop there. Correcting myth 5. Means are important, but so is the message. David King writes, says the tools used to engage millennials can't be confused with the strategies used to engage them. So always, yes, let's give some tools, but let's always keep asking the question, why? If we make electronic giving an option to give money to our congregations, we end up focused on this technical problem, how do we actually receive money? When it's better to address the broader culture around generosity in our congregations. If we think about our church website as an analogy, your church website practically really would need to have very little amount of technical information, maybe where your church is located and what time worship is. But most church websites, especially if you look at large congregations that spend a lot of time and money on their websites, they'll tell this story about more than just the time of worship, and they'll tell about what God is doing in their community. They'll welcome others. They'll invite others to join in God's mission there and try to paint a picture about the type of community and type of environment that the congregation is. So what's the message around that we tell in our congregations around collecting the offering? What's the message that we send out in our quarterly giving statements? To wrap up, I hope this approach is helpful, and here's one last takeaway. Looking over these 5 myths and 5 approaches to ministry, I hope you might have noticed a surprising reality. Each of the corrections, each of those 5 possibilities for ministry may apply to members of all ages. Sure, I came at those myths thinking about young adults originally. They may have a particular effect with young adults members today, but I expect they'll also find resonance well beyond those in the millennial generation. What an opportunity that is for all of us to do ministry together. What a gift. Thanks.
So this will be a time now for questions from the room, or do we have any coming in on our Twitter? None as of yet. We have about 6 or 7 minutes.
Do we have any questions in the room? If not, maybe you can speak into this. You kind of mentioned this at the end, because somebody was wondering if myth number 2 is the same for all people. The young adults are more skeptical that the church is a place that can be shaped.
Yeah, interesting. So are young adults more skeptical that the church is a place that can be shaped? I think maybe, and sort of footnote, it's dangerous to talk about young adults in general. This is the sort of part of the tension here. I think sure that there's a lot of sort of backstory and tension that and expectations, perhaps not good expectations, that many young adults bring to faith communities. And so if your church says, oh, great, you're a young person. We're glad to see you here. In 5 years, you can sit on a committee and have a seat on that committee for the next 9 years. If that's the type, sort of what it takes to be part of the community, then sure, we're not welcoming sort of a shaping of passions early on. If though we try to have an openness of listening to passions and having a community that's always trying to listen to what the next thing that God is doing in that place, I think young adults and many folks can be really open to the new vision, the new shape for ministry. And so it's about, if you hear a new idea for ministry, if your congregation is one that says yes and tries to think about how to do it, rather than says yes, but, or well, we haven't done it that way before. Okay. So it's about that culture of welcoming and shaping passions.
Any questions from in the room?
Yeah, in the back.
Let me get all the way back here. Hang on one second.
We thought about this. Since we want to be hospitable to those online, we're trying to get the questions to have a microphone associated. Great.
Do you have any numbers in terms of where millennials fit in terms of giving and what directions they're focusing on? You know, what are their particular interests that really drive and motivate them, and how do you kind of target to that?
Great. Yes. So there's not a lot of great research on this. Some of the stuff that's come out is, and it's called Millennial Impact Report, Millennial Giving. Yeah, I think it's called the Impact Studies. They're put out every year, but I'm skeptical of the research because it's funded by, it's all about workplaces, and it tends to be big corporations. And so the latest one was comparing workplace giving. And if you think about sort of who funds studies, that makes sense. There hasn't been a lot of really good research about just sort of young adults in general and giving. And even if there was, and I'm thinking about this in some of the research we're doing at Luther in the Center for Stewardship Leaders. I want to know what about like Lutherans and giving, or about 1/3 of young adults today are none of the above in terms, they collect none of the above when they're part of, to the question, are they part of a faith community or not? So about 1/3 of young adults don't consider themselves sort of Lutheran or Presbyterian or active in congregations. So more and more often then, those young adults who are active in our congregations, or at least on the edge of our congregations, they're the weird ones. So I want to, let's not think about them as this huge cohort of sort of part of everyone else, but let's try to listen to them and ask them questions and consider what's going on in their lives and how our congregations can nurture and be ministers to that.
I think that's the time we have for these questions, so thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. And we'll have about a 2-minute break once again for standing up, grabbing a quick cookie or cup of coffee, and we'll move on to our next speaker.